Rome had its great emperors, but it also had rulers who nearly destroyed everything. Betrayal, madness, and limitless extravagance. And one man whose disastrous decisions sped up the collapse of one of history's greatest empires. Who was this emperor? What made him so controversial? And how did he contribute to Rome's downfall? Stay until the end to uncover how this scandalous ruler changed the fate of the Roman Empire forever. During the height of the Roman Empire, Marcus Aurelius was not just a ruler. He was a thinker, a philosopher, and a man deeply reflective about both the empire and life itself. He was born in an era of great conquests, yet he embraced a vision of governance that challenged many of Rome's long-standing traditions. Known as the philosopher emperor, Marcus Aurelius believed that his duty extended far beyond expanding Rome's borders or celebrating grand military victories. His mission was to ensure that Rome was not only powerful, but also just and wise, an empire of virtue that reflected the ideals of Stoicism. He was not confined to the imperial palace or the Senate's advisory councils. Marcus Aurelius stood on the front lines, fighting alongside his troops in brutal battles against the barbarian tribes threatening Rome's borders. At the same time, he remained deeply devoted to his philosophy. In his moments of solitude, he wrote down his thoughts and reflections, which would later become known as meditations, a collection of insights on leadership, personal discipline, and living with dignity and purpose. His words became a beacon of morality and responsibility, emphasizing that true power came from within, from mastering one's impulses and desires. Marcus Aurelius also defied Roman tradition when he chose his son, Commodus, as his legitimate heir. Unlike many emperors who adopted experienced generals or statesmen to ensure the empire's continuity, Marcus Aurelius believed that Commodus, despite his youth and inexperience, had the potential to follow in his footsteps and lead Rome wisely. He envisioned molding his son in his own image, instilling in him the principles of Stoic philosophy, the weight of imperial authority, and the responsibility of ruling justly. To Marcus, succession should be a natural process. Rome should not be governed by strangers, but by the lineage of Caesar himself. However, while Marcus Aurelius made political decisions with the foresight of a serious and contemplative ruler, the Rome he had envisioned was on the verge of an unpredictable transformation. Fate, as he well understood, was uncertain, and the empire he had dedicated his life to protecting was about to be shaken by something beyond his control. The rise of a son who would abandon his father's principles entirely, ushering in a new era of excess and vanity. The legacy of Marcus Aurelius would become a stark contrast between wisdom and recklessness, between the philosopher king and the self-indulgent ruler. As the empire moved forward, Marcus Aurelius may never have imagined that his final lesson would not be taught on the battlefield or in political decisions, but in the silent struggle against the fate that awaited his own son. From that moment on, the Roman Empire would undergo a profound transition, one no longer guided by the wisdom of its rulers, but by the whims of a young emperor who barely understood the weight of the crown he had inherited. When Marcus Aurelius passed away in 180 AD, Rome stood at a crucial turning point in its long history. The empire was vast and stable, its people admiring the security it provided. The future of Rome now rested in the hands of Commodus, the young son of the emperor. At just 18 years old, he ascended to the throne, bearing the immense responsibility of continuing his father's legacy. The Roman world eagerly awaited his reign, hoping for a continuation of the Pax Romana, that golden era of peace and prosperity. But what followed was a series of events that would steer the empire off course. Shortly after taking power, Commodus displayed a behavior unlike anything expected of him. Unlike his father, he showed little interest in military campaigns or the complex political matters that governed the empire. While Marcus Aurelius had spent months, even years, away from Rome, stationed at the empire's frontiers, battling barbarian threats and maintaining order in the provinces, Commodus had a different vision of his role. Instead of following his father's example as an active military leader, he wasted no time returning to Rome after Marcus Aurelius' death, eager to enjoy the luxuries of the imperial capital while delegating most of his responsibilities to his subordinates. To Commodus, running the empire was something that could be managed from a distance. He entrusted the administration of Rome's vast territories to a circle of advisors and generals, many of whom were more interested in their own power than in the empire's well-being. As he withdrew from politics and warfare, Commodus indulged in a life of pleasure and extravagance, avoiding the difficult decisions that his father had faced. His lack of leadership soon took its toll on the empire. Without a strong ruler, internal stability began to crumble, and the provinces and borders grew increasingly unstable. It did not take long for the Roman people, who had hoped for a wise and capable leader, to realize that their new emperor was nothing like Marcus Aurelius. But Commodus' reign was not just about inexperience. The young emperor seemed to crave something beyond merely ruling Rome. He wanted to be remembered, to be immortalized. His obsession with recognition soon became the defining characteristic of his rule. The empire, which for centuries had been governed by emperors who understood the weight of the crown and their duty to the state, was now in the hands of a ruler who saw himself more as an entertainer than as the leader of a great civilization. And with this shift in focus, Rome would soon witness the slow unraveling of the stability it once knew, as power and responsibility gave way to spectacle and self-indulgence. What should have been a smooth transition, marked by the continuation of wisdom and strength, was turning into a game of power and distraction. Commodus, the young emperor, was steadily distancing himself from everything Marcus Aurelius had represented, and Rome, unaware of what lay ahead, was about to enter an era of chaos and excess. As Commodus consolidated his power, one thing became increasingly clear. He did not just want to rule, he wanted to be worshipped. The image of Marcus Aurelius, with his Stoic philosophy and his deep connection to the realities of the empire, was replaced by a ruler who saw himself as something far greater. Commodus did not want to be just an emperor, he wanted to be a god. To achieve this, he began reshaping both his own image and the very history of Rome to place himself at the center of a divine narrative. The first major change Commodus implemented was the construction of massive statues depicting him not as a mortal ruler, but as a deity. He had his likeness sculpted onto figures of Hercules, the legendary Greek hero symbolizing strength and courage. With a golden club in one hand and a lion's pelt draped over his shoulders, Commodus began presenting himself to the Roman people not just as an emperor, but as the living embodiment of Hercules in Rome. He wanted his subjects to see him not as an ordinary man, but as a being of superior power, someone who transcended human limitations. But Commodus did not stop at mere sculptures. He ordered that his image be stamped alongside gods and heroes on Roman currency, reinforcing the idea that he was not only ruling the empire, but also standing among the deities of the pantheon. His obsession with his own divinity led him to declare himself the Roman Hercules, and even the son of Jupiter, as if he were the very embodiment of divine authority. He surrounded himself with courtiers who endlessly flattered him, feeding his insatiable need for validation and glorification. But this insatiable pursuit of being seen as a god was not merely a matter of personal vanity. Commodus saw these actions as essential to solidifying his power and ensuring that no one dared to challenge him. He believed that by elevating himself to divinity, any attempt to defy his authority would not only be an offense against him, but against the gods themselves. By creating a cult around his own persona, Commodus sought to secure his immortality, not just in a figurative sense, but literally. He wanted his image to be eternal, for Rome to never forget his name, for him to be remembered as more than just an emperor, but as a legend. However, his obsession with this cult of personality had the opposite effect of what he had envisioned. Instead of inspiring respect and reverence, his actions began to alienate those around him, especially the Senate and the Roman aristocracy, who saw his growing arrogance and self-deification as a threat to Rome's traditions. The Senate, historically the bastion of republican authority, could not accept an emperor being treated as a deity. To them, this was an affront to the very principles of the republic that still lingered, even under the empire. As Commodus continued to place himself at the center of a cult dedicated to his own greatness, his relationship with ordinary Romans, senators, and even his own military officers began to deteriorate. But he didn't seem to care. What mattered to him was his image as a god, and he was willing to do whatever it took to ensure it was worshipped. Meanwhile, the empire was beginning to realize that as Commodus withdrew from the responsibilities of governance and indulged in luxury and vanity, true Roman leadership was dissolving, threatening the very future of Rome. As Commodus plunged deeper into his self-worship and his quest to be remembered as a divine figure, the politics of the Roman Empire began to unravel. The empire, once guided by the wisdom and strength of rulers like Marcus Aurelius, now found itself under a leader who seemed to despise the complexities of imperial administration. Political affairs, the needs of the people, and even military campaigns to secure the empire's borders were neglected as Commodus immersed himself in pleasure and extravagance. He completely withdrew from the responsibilities of governing, delegating all important matters to a circle of advisors and favorites. These individuals, often corrupt and unqualified, were not chosen for their competence or loyalty to the empire, but for their ability to please the emperor. Commodus surrounded himself with flatterers who, in exchange for favors and privileges, never opposed his decisions. The empire's administration began to rot from within, as provincial governors and senators were replaced by those willing to serve the emperor's whims. Meanwhile, Commodus distanced himself further from military affairs, an unthinkable move for a Roman emperor. Many of his predecessors had led military campaigns themselves, ensuring the empire remained secure and its borders defended. But instead of following in his father's footsteps, marching across the empire to maintain order, Commodus preferred to stay in Rome, seeking pleasure and displaying his power in arenas and lavish festivities. He was more concerned with his own image than with the well-being of the empire. This abandonment of political and military responsibilities had devastating consequences. The empire, already facing internal and external challenges, became increasingly vulnerable. Borders weakened, and distant provinces experienced more rebellions and invasions. Without active leadership, Rome lost its ability to respond quickly to military and administrative crises. The empire's control over its territories eroded, and local rulers began to gain more autonomy, further fragmenting the empire. Corruption spread like a disease in Rome. Those in power cared little for the empire, focusing instead on their own wealth and status. Urgent reforms to address financial, administrative, and social problems were ignored. The imperial machine that had functioned with precision under Marcus Aurelius was now adrift, incapable of making the necessary decisions to maintain internal stability. Commodus' lack of leadership extended beyond military and political matters. He also neglected critical economic reforms. With corruption on the rise and resources mismanaged, the empire faced a financial crisis. The emperor's excessive spending on festivals, games, and his insatiable pursuit of personal luxuries drained the imperial treasury. The Roman people, who had once taken pride in their great civilization, began to feel the effects of this decline. By abandoning politics and much-needed reforms, Commodus not only weakened the empire, but also set the stage for a period of instability that would mark the end of his dynasty and usher in an era of chaos. The empire, once strong and united, now seemed to be slowly crumbling under the weight of the emperor's negligence and self-indulgence. And while Commodus remained lost in his own cult of image, Rome braced itself for the consequences of a ruler who had forsaken the responsibilities of keeping the empire strong and united. As Rome began to feel the impacts of Commodus' disastrous rule, the emperor distanced himself even further from the institutions that had once ensured the empire's stability and prosperity. The Senate, a vital institution in Roman politics, was quickly sidelined by Commodus, who saw its members as a threat to his growing authority. With an increasingly autocratic style of leadership, he disregarded their advice and ignored their counsel. The already strained relationship between the emperor and the Senate collapsed completely, as Commodus surrounded himself with sycophants and preferred to trust his own whims and instincts rather than consult the experienced and wise rulers of the Republic. The Senate, whose influence had been diminishing since the time of Augustus, saw its role further reduced under Commodus' reign. The Roman Empire, which had begun as a republic where the Senate wielded significant authority, now found itself under an emperor who ruled with absolute power. The lack of dialogue and the exclusion of senators from major political decisions enraged them, but none dared to openly rebel, fearing Commodus' retaliation. This distancing from the Senate was not just an imperial whim. It was Commodus' way of asserting absolute power, free from any interference. The situation grew even more tense as Commodus sought to undermine the authority of other key figures within the empire, such as magistrates and provincial governors. Instead of entrusting experienced administrators with the governance of vast imperial territories, he preferred to appoint individuals based solely on their personal loyalty to him, regardless of their qualifications or competence. Many of these appointments were made for personal gain and to please the emperor, which only deepened administrative inefficiency and corruption throughout the empire. Additionally, Commodus' attitude toward the Roman people began to change. He became increasingly indifferent to their needs, even as they struggled with high taxes and resource shortages caused by the empire's mismanagement. Rather than seeking solutions to Rome's economic and social problems, Commodus focused solely on his own indulgences and gladiatorial spectacles. For him, festivals and games became the primary means of keeping the people distracted while the empire crumbled around them. This growing disconnect between Commodus and Rome's institutions led to increasing distrust and frustration. While the emperor saw himself as a divine figure, the Roman people and the Senate began to question who was truly governing the empire. It was a time of mounting instability, where Commodus' leadership was not only challenged by his own failures, but also by the alienation he had created between himself and the very institutions that had sustained Rome's greatness. With each passing day, the gap between Commodus and his predecessors became more evident. While Marcus Aurelius had been a wise leader, deeply concerned with the well-being of the empire and Rome's future, Commodus proved to be nothing more than a self-indulgent ruler, more interested in feeding his vanity than fulfilling his responsibilities. And as the empire began to feel the consequences of his detachment, the very foundations that had once sustained the great Rome grew increasingly fragile. With the empire under his command, Commodus decided that his main priority would be to live a life of excess, an existence immersed in luxury and pleasure, with no regard for the cost to the empire. The great Rome, once a symbol of organization and stability, now saw its resources drained to satisfy the whims of an emperor who seemed to have completely lost his sense of responsibility. Commodus was constantly surrounded by lavish feasts and banquets where waste was the norm. His dinners were not just meals, but extravagant displays of opulence, featuring rare and exotic foods, wines imported from across the empire, and non-stop entertainment. He spent vast sums to ensure that his court was always immersed in luxury, with courtiers and flatterers doing everything to please him, often in exchange for favors and privileges. At the same time, Commodus surrounded himself with lovers, indulging in a constant display of sensuality and excess. Rome, once proud of its grandeur and discipline, now found itself marked by a lack of moderation and a ruler who was indifferent to the real struggles of its people. While the Roman populace faced economic and social hardships, Commodus surrendered himself to a life of luxury, living in a bubble of pleasure and complete disregard for the needs of his subjects. Commodus's extravagance also extended to his personal life and the entertainment he organized. The arenas, where gladiators fought in bloody battles, became a defining symbol of his rule. The emperor did not merely watch the fights, he actively participated, staging battles in which he faced opponents who were weakened or poorly armed to ensure his victory. He believed these spectacles not only enhanced his aura of invincibility, but also pleased the people, keeping them distracted while the empire crumbled around them. Moreover, an empire that had once upheld a level of respect for tradition and order was now at the mercy of a man who preferred indulging in the pleasures of the moment rather than ensuring its long-term stability. Commodus did not see himself as a responsible ruler, but as a figure above the needs and concerns of the empire. He believed his image of power and strength, embodied in his self-proclaimed title as the Roman Hercules, was more important than the actual governance of Rome. His obsession with luxury and entertainment led to total negligence of the empire's finances. Funds that should have been invested in infrastructure improvements, military defenses, and support for provincial governors were instead squandered on his personal desires. Rome, already suffering from corruption and mismanagement, was now teetering on the brink of financial collapse, and Commodus's extravagance only deepened the empire's crisis. Commodus's lavish lifestyle was a double-edged sword. On one hand, he captivated the Roman elite and the public with grand spectacles and displays of wealth. On the other, his utter disregard for the empire's needs and efficient administration fueled growing discontent. The empire, once the pillar of the ancient world, was now rotting from within as its emperor indulged in a life of excess, oblivious to how his unchecked indulgence was eroding Rome's very foundations. In his relentless pursuit of adulation and absolute power, Commodus went further than any emperor before him. His obsession with his own image reached a point where he no longer wished to be merely recognized as Rome's ruler. He wanted to be worshipped as an immortal deity. The idea of being seen as just another man was not enough for Commodus. He sought to be adored, revered, and above all, immortalized as a celestial figure, placing himself on par with the gods of the Roman pantheon. To achieve this, Commodus commissioned a series of monumental statues depicting himself not just as Rome's emperor, but as Hercules, the demigod of Greco-Roman mythology. These statues portrayed him draped in a lion's pelt, wielding a club, and standing in a triumphant pose meant to symbolize his divine strength. His likeness was sculpted alongside gods and mythological heroes, reinforcing his belief that he belonged among the most powerful and revered beings in existence. Commodus wanted his image to be impossible to ignore, a constant reminder that he was above all criticism or doubt. Beyond the statues, Commodus introduced a state-sanctioned cult dedicated to his worship. He ordered the minting of new coins bearing his likeness alongside mythological symbols, branding himself as the Roman Hercules and the son of Jupiter, as if he were a being unmatched even among the gods. These coins circulated throughout the empire, ensuring that his image reached every corner of Roman territory. He did not merely want to be recognized as emperor. He wanted to be venerated, worshipped, and ultimately transformed into an eternal icon of Rome. Commodus's decision to declare himself a living deity not only distanced him from the reality of the empire, but also sparked outrage among Rome's elites, particularly the Senate and the aristocracy. The senators, deeply rooted in the traditions of the Republic, saw his self-deification as a direct threat to Rome's political foundations. To them, the idea of an emperor demanding worship was an insult to the ancient republican institutions, which had never tolerated such blatant egomania. In an effort to further cement his divine image, Commodus went so far as to rename various parts of the empire in his honor. The city of Rome itself was rebranded as Colonia Commodiana, as if the name of the eternal city, the very soul of Rome, was now inseparable from his own greatness. He also assigned his name to numerous provinces and institutions, creating a network of places and entities that reflected his supposed magnificence. His name was no longer merely associated with the empire. He sought to make it an everlasting imprint, a constant reminder of his absolute dominion over the world. However, Commodus's relentless quest for deification and recognition had the opposite effect of what he intended. Instead of being worshipped, his obsession with his own image further alienated both the population and the Senate. To many, he became a ridiculous figure, not a wise and powerful ruler, but a man desperate for attention, willing to do anything to reinforce his status. His attempt to become a god was not seen as a testament to his greatness, but as a desperate effort to escape the failures of his rule and the mounting criticism against his reign. In seeking to be adored as a deity, Commodus ultimately lost the respect of the institutions that upheld the empire. His efforts to immortalize himself did not result in widespread veneration, but in growing rejection. The more he tried to elevate himself to divine status, the more his humanity, complete with its flaws and weaknesses, became apparent to those who watched him. Thus, his cult of self-worship, rather than securing his place in history as a great emperor, contributed to his isolation and the increasing dissatisfaction with his rule. As Rome faced internal struggles, Commodus grew increasingly detached from matters of governance, choosing instead a lifestyle that reflected his insatiable need for adoration and vanity. Rather than addressing the empire's problems, he immersed himself further in the pleasures of life and the grand spectacles that defined his reign, most notably the gladiatorial games, which became the centerpiece of his rule. The arenas, where the Roman people gathered to watch bloody fights between gladiators and even between men and wild animals, became more than mere entertainment for Commodus. They became his personal stage. The emperor was not content with merely watching from a distance. He wanted to be the center of attention, the hero of the arena. Unlike other rulers who limited themselves to being spectators of these combats, Commodus decided to take part in them directly, which had a significant impact on his public image. He regularly participated in gladiatorial games, dressed as Hercules himself, and fought against gladiators. Though these battles were carefully rigged to ensure his victory, Commodus' opponents were always chosen to be weakened or poorly armed, allowing him to emerge victorious without truly fighting. Even so, he reveled in the adulation of the crowd, which cheered his victories, as if he were a genuine hero. Commodus' fights were a mix of spectacle and arrogance. He believed that by defeating his opponents in the arena, he was reaffirming his position as Rome's greatest and most invincible leader. But his true motivation was not the defense of the empire or the honor of Rome. It was, above all, his desire to be worshipped as a figure of unquestionable strength. He wanted the people to see him not just as an emperor, but as a demigod, someone whose victories in the arena confirmed his divine status. However, This behavior made Rome's elite uneasy. To the senators and aristocracy, an emperor participating in gladiatorial combat was an insult to imperial dignity. The role of an emperor was not to stain himself with blood in the arenas, but to rule with wisdom, courage, and justice. The fact that Commodus preferred to put on a show rather than make crucial decisions for the empire was seen as a major failure in his leadership. Even the Roman people, who initially applauded his appearances in the arena, began to see how hollow his pursuit of glory was. Gladiators, once regarded as mere fighters, now realized they were simply pawns in Commodus' game, manipulated to reinforce his image. Entertainment, which should have been a source of relief for the people, became a symbol of his obsession with himself. Commodus' reign, which had begun with high expectations and promises of stability, was now being defined by his personal choices and his excessive use of the arenas to assert his authority. Instead of solidifying his position as a wise and strong emperor, he turned himself into a traveling spectacle, someone more interested in performing than in facing the empire's real challenges. This transformation, far from strengthening his image, was the first step toward the weakening of his authority and the growing disapproval that would mark the final years of his reign. Lucilla, Commodus' sister, had always been an important figure in the Roman court, known for her intelligence and sharp perception of her brother's failures as a ruler. Since Commodus' rise to power, Lucilla had watched with increasing concern as the empire declined under his leadership. As Rome sank further into disorder due to his excesses and lack of governance, Lucilla became more and more convinced that he was leading the empire to ruin. Commodus' erratic decisions, his withdrawal from the empire's administration, and his obsessive focus on the arenas began to stir resentment, not only among the population, but also within Rome's own elite. Aware that the situation was becoming unsustainable, Lucilla began secretly meeting with senators and members of the Praetorian Guard. She knew that the only way to save Rome from destruction was to get rid of Commodus, but to do so, she needed powerful allies and a flawless plan. The conspiracy was carefully orchestrated. Lucilla managed to secure the support of influential figures, including disillusioned senators and members of the Praetorian Guard, who saw the emperor's growing incompetence as a direct threat to the empire's security and stability. The plan was simple: overthrow Commodus once and for all, restore order in Rome, and ensure that the empire was ruled by someone more capable. However, despite the meticulous planning, the lack of secrecy and growing tension within the court proved to be the conspiracy's downfall. One of the conspirators, likely fearing for his own safety, betrayed Lucilla and revealed the plot to Commodus. The emperor, always paranoid and distrustful, immediately learned of the assassination attempt and, in a fit of rage, launched a ruthless investigation. Commodus' response was swift and brutal. Lucilla, who had believed she was protected by her allies' loyalty, found herself isolated and vulnerable when the conspirators were captured. There was no mercy. She was quickly accused of treason, and the trust she had placed in those around her crumbled in the face of a harsh reality. Not only did the assassination attempt fail, but it also led to Lucilla's execution, along with everyone involved in the conspiracy. Enraged by his own sister's betrayal, Commodus ordered the death of every conspirator, leaving behind a trail of blood and devastation. The conspiracy's failure not only reinforced Commodus' grip on power, but also deepened his paranoia. He no longer trusted anyone, fearing that more people would try to betray him. His obsession with his own security and his desire to eliminate any threat to his authority turned Rome into a city ruled by fear and suspicion. His alliances with certain advisors quickly crumbled, and his trust in those around him was shattered, making his rule even more fragile. Meanwhile, Rome, already unstable, continued to spiral further into chaos, now under the shadow of an emperor who had become even more paranoid and ruthless. The failure of Lucilla's conspiracy, far from bringing peace, only increased tension and distrust within the empire's highest ranks, setting the stage for even more dramatic events to come. With the failed assassination attempt and Lucilla's conspiracy dismantled, Commodus sank into a period of extreme paranoia. His behavior became increasingly erratic, and his trust in anyone, even those closest to him, completely disappeared. The empire, already struggling due to a lack of effective governance, now found itself at the mercy of an emperor who saw betrayal around every corner and enemies everywhere. The repression was swift and ruthless. Commodus no longer tolerated any form of opposition, real or imagined. The conspirators, whether they were senators, members of the Praetorian Guard, or even mere servants suspected of aiding the emperor's sister, were sentenced to death in cruel and public executions. There were no fair trials, only accusations and immediate executions. Anyone who dared to question Commodus' power, or who simply caught as suspicious, was swiftly eliminated. The atmosphere in Rome became increasingly oppressive. Fear reigned, as any misplaced word could lead to imprisonment or execution. The emperor, now obsessed with his own safety, surrounded himself with spies and potential traitors, and anyone deemed suspicious of conspiracy was quickly placed on a blacklist. The Senate, already sidelined during Commodus' rule, now found itself completely powerless in the face of his tyranny, fearing for their lives as the empire plunged further into chaos. Beyond public executions, Commodus also ordered brutal torture for those who had survived the initial purge. He wanted to ensure that every last person involved in the conspiracy, even those on the fringes, was punished as an example to anyone who might consider defying him. The streets of Rome, once vibrant and full of life, now felt dark and suffocating, with an air of despair hanging over the city. The empire that had once been a strong and admired power was now being consumed by its own leadership, and Commodus himself, in his desperate attempt to secure his rule, had become Rome's greatest enemy. But the terror he imposed did not stop at executions. Commodus began dismantling any power network that could threaten him. He removed or killed provincial governors he deemed disloyal and replaced them with his own corrupt allies, who were more interested in pleasing him than in governing competently. The empire, already weakened by his neglect, became even more vulnerable to both internal and external exploitation. Commodus's brutal repression not only destroyed the last remnants of stability in the empire, but also isolated him from any potential support. He was surrounded by flatterers and accomplices, without true allies or friends. His reign turned into a government of fear, where trust was replaced by paranoia, and Rome, once the eternal city, became a stage for terror, where the blood of imagined traitors was spilled daily. This tyranny, far from consolidating Commodus's power, only accelerated the empire's decline. The oppressive and violent atmosphere eroded morale and cohesion, creating an unstable society where the very foundations of Rome were being torn apart by the hand of its own emperor. In the final years of Commodus's rule, the figure of Tigidius Prenus rose as the true power behind the throne. Although Commodus remained the official emperor, the actual administration of the empire was in Perennis's hands, a shrewd and ambitious man who had skillfully infiltrated Rome's highest circles of power. Originally a distinguished military officer, Perennis was appointed by Commodus himself, who wanted someone capable of managing the empire while he indulged in personal extravagances and gladiatorial games. Perennis wasted no time asserting his own power. He controlled the military with an iron grip, manipulated the Praetorian Guard, and used his position to accumulate wealth and influence. Corruption spread through every layer of imperial administration. Officials were bought and sold, loyalties were forged for personal gain, and the well-being of the empire took a backseat to private interests. Perennis was a master of political maneuvering in the shadows, and his rise to power did not go unnoticed. As he consolidated his authority, Perennis ushered in a new era of repression and manipulation. Under his supervision, Commodus remained a puppet, an emperor without real power, but with an intact public image, while Perennis governed with a blend of Machiavellian cunning and ruthless brutality. The empire became a mere facade, where real decisions were made in secret, far from the Roman public's view. However, Perennis's relentless ambition and insatiable thirst for power began to create tensions. He was not a man of restraint, and his quest for absolute control earned him enemies both inside and outside the imperial court. The fear he instilled among officials and senators eventually created the perfect breeding ground for betrayal. His own desire to dominate the empire led to the suppression of anyone who dared to question his actions. Senators, officers, and even members of the Praetorian Guard, who saw Perennis's influence as excessive, started conspiring against him, fearing that he might become the next Commodus, a tyrant whose reckless hunger for power would bring Rome to ruin. As paranoia turned into a real threat, Perennis himself began to sense that his position was becoming untenable. The growing pressure from internal enemies, who united to bring him down, ultimately led to his downfall. Accused of treason and corruption, Perennis was arrested and executed, but his death did not bring the peace Rome so desperately needed. Instead, it created an even greater power vacuum. one that unleashed chaos among those seeking to carve out their own share of influence. Without stable leadership, the empire became even more vulnerable to disorder and instability, while the weary and fearful Romans wondered how much longer their great civilization could endure before it collapsed entirely. After Perennius' death, the Roman Empire plunged into a whirlwind of uncertainty, with various figures vying for power in the vacuum he left behind. Among these opportunists was Cleander, a former slave with boundless ambitions who quickly became Commodus's new favorite. His rise was swift, fueled by the emperor's trust, as Commodus, always eager to please those who flattered him, granted Cleander more power than he could have ever dreamed. Cleander wasted no time exploiting his new position. He used his direct access to the emperor to amass wealth and influence, becoming the most powerful man in the empire alongside Commodus. He was not just an efficient administrator, but also a ruthless manipulator. His ascent was marked by a series of calculated moves. He surrounded himself with loyal allies and eliminated anyone who posed a threat to his authority. His grip on the empire, though effective in administrative terms, did not go unnoticed by Rome's elite, who saw him as an upstart former slave wielding far more power than any man should. As Cleander's power grew, the empire's situation worsened. Food shortages and poor provincial management directly affected the population. Social tensions escalated as people suffered from high taxes and a lack of basic resources. The reforms Rome desperately needed were neglected, as Cleander focused on maintaining his status and increasing his wealth. Instead of addressing economic problems, he fueled resentment by distributing wealth only to his inner circle, while the majority of the population bore the weight of the crisis. As conditions deteriorated, opposition to Cleander's rule intensified. The people, exhausted by corruption and hardship, began to revolt. During this period of rising unrest, a massive popular uprising erupted. The streets of Rome were filled with protests, and demands for justice and economic reforms grew louder. Cleander, in his arrogance, believed he could maintain control, but the widespread discontent could no longer be ignored. The peak of his downfall came when, in a desperate attempt to appease the enraged masses, Commodus decided to sacrifice Cleander. It was a direct blow to his former favorite. Commodus, trying to calm the people and protect himself, ordered Cleander's execution, a move that, while temporarily soothing Roman anger, did nothing to heal the empire's deep wounds. With Cleander's death, the empire did not find a new leader capable of restoring order. On the contrary, instability spread even further. The absence of a strong central government and the continued exploitation of the empire's resources paved the way for further crises and revolts. Cleander, who had once risen to power with the promise of stability and prosperity, became yet another failure in the long list of disasters pushing Rome closer to its downfall. His rise and fall were a clear reflection of the empire's state, a realm no longer recognizable, consumed by corruption and the collapse of its once great virtues. As the empire sank deeper into the hands of incompetent and greedy leaders, Rome's economy suffered an unprecedented collapse. Inefficient administration, rampant corruption, and neglect of the people's needs pushed the empire to the brink of chaos. Food prices soared, and the provinces struggled with shortages of essential resources, fueling a wave of revolts that spread rapidly across Rome. The Romans, already exhausted by decades of political instability and increasing decline, began to rise up. The streets of Rome, once grand and full of life, became the stage for protests and riots. Hunger and poverty struck the most vulnerable, while the ruling elite continued to indulge in luxury. The gap between social classes became unbearable, and despair gripped the lower classes, who demanded radical change. The senators, who had long lost their influence, began to distance themselves even further from Commodus and his corrupt ministers, fearing for their own survival. Many started conspiring in secret, hoping that something could be done to restore stability to the empire. The fear of a popular uprising spread throughout Rome, and even those who had once supported Commodus began to question his decisions and his ability to govern. Popular revolts became more frequent, and cries for justice echoed through the streets of the city. The economic situation reached a breaking point, with the people demanding immediate change. The empire, already weakened by corruption, lacked the resources or structure to handle the uprising. The military forces, once a source of power and control, were disorganized and fragmented, and the absence of strong leadership only fueled the growing rebellions. In a last-ditch effort to save himself, Commodus attempted to appease the population by promising reforms and food distribution. But his empty promises were not enough to calm the enraged crowd. Rome, once the greatest power in the world, now stood on the brink of collapse. Popular protests became increasingly violent, and the Roman Empire seemed to be disintegrating before the eyes of its own citizens. The uprising was not just an expression of economic discontent, but a reflection of deep disillusionment with the ruling class. Rome was no longer the great civilization that had once ruled the known world. The ideals of justice, honor, and virtue that had been the foundation of Rome's greatness had been corrupted, and now the empire faced its darkest hour. The people, weary of broken promises and a government that ignored their needs, were ready to demand change, even if it meant the fall of the empire itself. Economic ruin and social unrest marked the turning point of an era of decline. The empire, now weakened, had lost its sense of direction. Corruption, selfishness, and inefficiency had destroyed everything Rome had built, leaving behind only the remnants of a civilization that had once been powerful and respected. The people's resistance and the growing chaos in the streets were clear signs that the end was near. As the empire lay in ruins, with the economy on the verge of collapse and the Roman people on the brink of a full-scale revolt, an unforeseen disaster struck. A massive fire devastated part of the city of Rome. The flames consumed markets, entire neighborhoods, and even public buildings, leaving behind a city in ruins. But to Commodus, this fire was not just a tragedy. It was a perfect opportunity to reinforce his personal image and once again attempt to win back the people's loyalty. As the fire raged through the city, Commodus saw it as a golden opportunity to present himself as Rome's savior. He quickly gathered the citizens and announced that he would use this event to rebuild the city in a new glorious era. As was his custom, Commodus exploited the tragedy to strengthen his cult of personality. Instead of focusing on the urgent needs of reconstruction, the emperor launched a personal propaganda campaign, using the fire as an excuse to rename the city of Rome as Colonia Commodiana, a name that reflected his growing obsession with his own worship. Commodus also seized the moment to introduce a series of architectural reforms, all centered on glorifying his name and image. Monuments and statues bearing his likeness appeared everywhere, depicting him as the hero who had brought renewal to Rome. The fire, which could have been a moment of reflection on the city's decline, was instead turned into a celebration of his supposed greatness. In his address to the people, Commodus presented himself as an emperor who, beyond saving Rome from the flames, was ensuring its eternal magnificence. He ordered the minting of new coins featuring his face alongside mythological and divine figures, distributing them among the Romans to ensure that his image was omnipresent. Under his distorted vision of grandeur, Rome would be reconstructed as a symbol of his absolute power. As the city burned and the victims of the fire struggled to rebuild their lives, Commodus once again demonstrated his indifference to the real needs of the people. Instead of directing efforts toward aiding the victims and restoring public order, he was more concerned with making sure the disaster was remembered as a milestone of his own greatness. The empire, once governed by principles of justice and duty, was now in the hands of an emperor who treated every calamity as an opportunity to reinforce his personal cult. At first, this behavior might have seemed like an attempt at recovery, but it only intensified public resentment. The empty promises and relentless propaganda were increasingly met with disdain, and Commodus became more isolated than ever. While he saw the fire as a chance to elevate himself to divine status, the reality was quite different. The city lay in ruins, the people were dissatisfied, and the empire teetered on the edge of collapse. What Commodus failed to understand was that instead of saving Rome, he was accelerating its downfall. With the empire sinking into economic and social crises, Commodus made a decision that symbolized the total decadence of his rule. He turned the Roman government into a spectacle. Instead of focusing on the effective administration of the empire or addressing urgent problems affecting the population, Commodus used the opulence of games and arenas to keep the people distracted and seemingly content. What had once been a tool of entertainment became the primary mechanism of social control, challenging the ancient political traditions that had sustained Rome for centuries. Obsessed with portraying himself as the hero who was saving the empire, Commodus made gladiatorial games the main stage for his self-aggrandizement. He not only organized public fights, but attended every event, striving to be the center of attention. Through these combats, where he always emerged victorious, Commodus wanted to prove to the people that he was the Roman Hercules, an almost divine figure, unbeatable and strong. Every fight, every spectacle, was an opportunity to reinforce his identity as an indestructible emperor. Moreover, Commodus began involving the Senate and traditional power structures in his twisted vision of governance. The Senate, once the institution that symbolized Rome's control and stability, was reduced to a passive audience at his grand spectacles. Instead of political debates or administrative decisions, the only thing that took center stage was entertainment. Every act of Commodus, every performance in the arenas, was aimed at demonstrating his superiority while diminishing the relevance of institutions like the Senate, which, though already weakened, still attempted to resist. The Roman government had become a circus. What had once been serious political decisions aimed at the welfare of a vast and diverse empire had turned into theatrical performances. Instead of dealing with issues like border defense or provincial administration, Commodus spent his time inventing new ways to showcase himself, often in absurd situations. The figure of the emperor, once respected and feared, had gradually turned into a caricature. As Rome sank deeper into corruption and decadence, Commodus reveled in his own world of illusions. He saw the games as a way to keep the people entertained, but in reality, these events only masked the lack of real governance. The empire was slowly crumbling, but the spectacle continued. The people, tired of empty promises and the emperor's disregard for true leadership, began to realize that Commodus' games were nothing more than a distraction from the empire's impending collapse. The Roman government, once a complex machine of administration, justice, and defense, had become a stage for the ego of an emperor. History, however, does not forgive rulers who succumb to appearances and spectacle. What Commodus failed to realize was that by replacing politics with entertainment, he was accelerating Rome's downfall. He became increasingly isolated, and the people, though still living under oppression, began to question the true motives of an emperor who preferred to be a performer rather than a leader. The games became more than just a distraction. They turned into a symbol of a great civilization's decline, where governance was reduced to an illusion, a mere spectacle, while Rome sank deeper into the shadows of its own decadence. Commodus' obsession with gladiators knew no bounds, and over time, he transformed arena combat into something entirely different. What had once been battles of honor and courage fought by skilled warriors became a stage for sheer exhibitionism, where Commodus stood out in an increasingly exaggerated and ridiculous manner. He had no interest in real combat or in respecting gladiatorial traditions. Instead, he used the fights as a means to reinforce his image as an invincible hero. The gladiators, once respected as formidable fighters, were now reduced to mere puppets in a game of appearances. Commodus insisted on fighting in the arenas, but his battles were carefully staged to ensure his victory, with his opponents handpicked to guarantee an easy win. He fought against gladiators who were already weakened or against enemies who were unfairly armed, making his victories effortless. This was not true combat, but a spectacle of vanity, where the emperor placed himself at the center without facing any real danger. The gladiatorial tradition, which had started as military training and later became a popular form of entertainment, was corrupted by Commodus. Instead of honoring the warriors and the value of competition, he stripped the fights of their deeper significance, using them as yet another tool to feed his ego. To him, the true meaning of the gladiators did not matter. What he wanted was to turn the arena into a stage for his own self-worship. At first, the audience was captivated by these performances, but over time, they began to see through the artificiality of the fights. Commodus was no longer displaying the true strength or bravery of an emperor, but a distorted version of himself, wrapped in pomp and spectacle. Gladiators were no longer respected for their skills, but were instead reduced to mere props in a propaganda game. What had once been a test of skill and strength had become a farce, where Commodus placed himself in the spotlight while the real warriors were pushed into the background. People began to lose their sense of honor in combat, and the corruption of tradition spread, tainting a fundamental part of Roman culture. Rome, once an empire of conquests and strong values, was now ruled by an emperor who saw even its most ancient traditions as nothing more than a stage for self-promotion. The impact on Roman culture was devastating. What had once united the people around ideals of bravery and courage had turned into a mere display of ego and frivolity. This destruction of gladiatorial tradition symbolized the fall of a Rome that had once been respected for its strength and discipline. In his quest to portray himself as an invincible hero, Commodus not only disrespected the gladiators, but also ruined one of the most deeply rooted traditions in Roman society. He had become an emperor who, in pursuit of personal glory, destroyed what was most genuine in his own city's culture. Commodus' ego knew no limits, and his obsession with appearing invincible led him to an even darker practice. He began personally killing gladiators and animals in the arena. His need to reaffirm his strength and courage was no longer limited to staged battles, but evolved into displays of sheer brutality. Commodus wanted the people to see him not just as an emperor who fought in the arena, but as a true hero who could face the fiercest enemies and wild beasts personally. During these spectacles, he would stand before wounded or unarmed gladiators who could barely resist and kill them with his own hands, as if this were a demonstration of bravery and power. But the reality was quite different. Commodus was not proving his courage. He was simply asserting his authority in a cruel and inhumane way. To him, the gladiators were nothing more than tools for his vanity, and the animals, once hunted to prove strength or provide grand entertainment, had now become mere victims of his whims. In his obsession with placing himself above all others, he took these executions to grotesque extremes. Killing both humans and animals in the arena was his way of reinforcing his image as the Roman Hercules, the one who could dominate all. But unlike the mythical hero who faced real challenges, Commodus was not showing bravery. He was merely devaluing life itself, turning the arena into a stage for public executions. At first, the public was dazzled by his victories and thrilled by the novelty of an emperor in the arena. But as the fights became more of an abuse of power than a true competition, discomfort grew. The spectacle lost its appeal as Commodus revealed a darker side of his personality, where the pleasure of killing and flaunting his authority took precedence over the honor of combat. Yet as this cruelty spread throughout the arenas, Commodus failed to realize that he was pushing Romans further away from their own traditions. People began to question whether this kind of leadership was what Rome needed. He had turned something once symbolic of bravery and dignity into an act of public sadism. The gladiators were no longer the ones deserving of respect. The emperor was, in his thirst for power, destroying everything noble about Rome's traditions. Thus, Commodus' personal executions in the arena were not just displays of his brutality. They were also reflections of his moral downfall. He was not only breaking with Rome's traditions, but also burying any last vestiges of respect for life and honor that had once defined the empire. To Commodus, the arena was no longer a battlefield, but a stage where he became the center of everything, even if it meant sacrificing humanity for his own vanity. In a desperate attempt to solidify his image as the Roman Hercules, Commodus made an even more extravagant decision. He planned an epic fight for the new year, a spectacle he believed would mark the grand rebirth of his power and persona. The arena would be the setting for a monumental event, where the emperor would battle gladiators and adversaries in a show meant to demonstrate his absolute strength once again. He envisioned that by defeating a series of opponents in a legendary battle, he would regain the people's loyalty and re-establish his dominance over Rome. This fight, however, would be anything but fair. Commodus left no room for uncertainty. He wanted complete control over the event, and his obsession with appearing invincible ensured that his opponents were chosen specifically to guarantee his victory. The gladiators were selected not for their talent, but for their inability to defeat him. He saw himself as a mythological hero and wanted the arena to be the stage for his eternal glory. To him, the New Year's fight was more than just a spectacle. It was an opportunity to rise again and prove to the entire empire that he was still in command. But his decision had unforeseen consequences. As he prepared for the grand event, his closest advisors, such as Marcia and Narcissus, began to question the wisdom of his choice. This was not just another display of vanity. It was pushing the empire further into a spiral of decline. They knew that the fight, even if staged, could become the catalyst for growing dissatisfaction among both the lower classes and, more importantly, Rome's elite. As a ruler, Commodus was supposed to be the highest authority, not a mere performer. Despite growing concerns, Commodus ignored all warnings, believing that his image and spectacle were all Rome needed. He arranged the fight to strengthen his position and start the new year on the right foot, convinced that only he could guarantee his own victory. In his mind, he was a divine figure in his own narrative, believing that this act of bravery would bring the empire back in his favor. When the day finally arrived, the event became a grand display of vanity. Commodus paraded through the arena with the confidence of an emperor who saw himself as invincible. But as the crowd watched, something became clear. This was not a fair fight, but a demonstration of his desperate need for adoration, to be placed above all others. His empire, his officials, and even the Roman people now found themselves witnessing a spectacle that had nothing to do with honor or dignity. Commodus was simply feeding his own ego, once again ignoring the true leadership that Rome needed. The fight was not just a sham. It was a reflection of Commodus' growing detachment from reality. Instead of ruling wisely, he withdrew further into his bubble of self-worship, surrounded by sycophants while Rome, in truth, was beginning to crumble under his reign. What he imagined as a display of his enduring greatness ended up symbolizing the biggest failure of his leadership. His disconnection from the empire and his belief that spectacle was more important than actual governance. For the empire, this fight was not just a disgrace. It was a sign that sooner or later, Commodus would have to face the consequences of his own arrogance and indifference to what truly mattered to Rome. As the empire sank deeper into decadence, Commodus became increasingly immune to the advice of the few who still tried to protect him from his own destruction. Marcia, his lover and confidant, and Narcissus, his powerful minister, repeatedly warned him about the dangers of his erratic behavior, especially after the disastrous New Year's fight, which had severely damaged his image. But Commodus, obsessed with his self-image and growing more detached from reality, refused to listen. Marcia, an intelligent woman with sharp insight, knew that the empire was on the brink of collapse. She realized that Commodus' narcissism was not just a personal flaw, but a poison that was infecting Rome as a whole. She understood that for Rome to survive and regain stability, Commodus needed to make wiser decisions and stop ruling based on his vanity. Narcissus, on the other hand, was growing increasingly frustrated with the empire's instability. His position of power was at risk due to the emperor's mismanagement, and he knew that unless something changed, the empire would not last much longer. But Commodus was consumed by his own reflection. Every piece of advice was met with disdain, every warning dismissed as an attempt to weaken him. He saw those who dared to challenge him as traitors or jealous schemers. In his mind, no one could truly comprehend the greatness he believed he possessed. Instead of trusting those who sought to save Rome, he pushed them away and surrounded himself with flatterers who worshipped him without question. He grew increasingly isolated, convinced that his impulses and eccentricities were signs of genius, not tyranny. The empire, however, could not be ruled this way. Marcia and Narcissus realized that without immediate action, disaster was inevitable. Commodus' disregard for Rome's institutions, his obsession with his image, and his indifference to the empire's real problems had created a perfect storm. And while he indulged in luxury and vanity, the empire crumbled around him. Marcia, torn between the love she still had for Commodus and her duty to Rome, and Narcissus, more aware than ever that his own position was in jeopardy, began to see that something had to be done. They knew there was no longer any hope of convincing Commodus to change. The solution now was far more drastic and dangerous than either of them had ever imagined. They understood that Rome's survival depended on the removal of Commodus, but doing so would put them in an extremely delicate position. It was no longer about persuading the emperor to rule more wisely, but about saving Rome from its own destruction, a path that would force them to make unthinkable decisions. As Commodus continued his life of excess, his closest advisors were already plotting in secret. It was only a matter of time before the empire, collapsing under his rule, would demand a change. And Marcia and Narcissus were beginning to realize that if they did not act soon, Rome's decline might become irreversible. With the empire on the verge of collapse and Commodus more lost in his vanity and indifference than ever, Marcia and Narcissus made a risky and radical decision. Watching Rome disintegrate under Commodus' reign finally led them to an inevitable conclusion. If Rome was to have any chance of survival, the emperor had to be removed. The conspiracy began to take shape in the shadows, with Marcia and Narcissus proceeding cautiously, planning each move with precision. They knew that any mistake could mean not only their own deaths, but also the final ruin of Rome. Trust in Commodus was at an all-time low, and the fear he inspired, combined with his growing paranoia, made the plan even more dangerous. For Marcia, the matter was even more personal. She knew that in his state of obsession, Commodus would not hesitate to destroy her if he ever discovered the truth. But Rome's fate outweighed everything, and she was willing to do whatever was necessary to prevent its complete collapse. Narcissus, for his part, acted with calculated coldness. His personal ambition aligned with his desire to save Rome from imminent destruction, and he had no intention of letting this opportunity slip away. The conspiracy began to spread, with more and more senators and officials joining the plan, all united in the goal of ending Commodus' tyrannical rule. The plan was meticulously crafted. Commodus' death needed to be quick, silent, and efficient. A public execution, like many of the assassinations Commodus had ordered, was too risky. They could not allow the empire to immediately suspect what had happened. The conspiracy had to be discreet, avoiding suspicion until the decisive moment arrived. Meanwhile, Commodus continued indulging in extravagance, completely oblivious to the danger approaching. He placed more and more trust in the sycophants around him and ignored those who still had Rome's best interests at heart. The empire was slowly rotting, but Commodus, trapped in his bubble of power and fame, could not see the storm on the horizon. Tension mounted as the plan neared its execution. Marcia and Narcissus knew that if they failed, their deaths would be certain, and the empire would fall further under the rule of a leader who only fueled its problems instead of solving them. They had to be swift, they had to be intelligent, and above all, they had to be brave. Rome's future depended on one bold act, and that act was about to take place. The plan was in motion, but the conspiracy Marcia and Narcissus had orchestrated would not go as expected. They had chosen a subtle approach, poisoning Commodus, a strong and fast-acting poison that would kill him silently, without drawing attention. The idea was to make his death appear natural, avoiding an open confrontation and the unpredictable consequences of an explicit assassination. Marcia, with what seemed to be a flawless plan, was tasked with administering the poison directly. She was close to Commodus, which gave her easy access, and he trusted her enough to accept her offerings. However, what appeared to be a clean and efficient solution quickly turned into a disaster. The poison, though potent, failed to take immediate effect as planned. In one of his typical moments of indulgence, Commodus drank the poison mixture. But instead of dying swiftly, he began to fall ill in a slow and agonizing manner, creating an even more dangerous situation. The failed assassination attempt sent a wave of panic and despair among the conspirators. Marcia and Narcissus were in a state of alarm, fully aware that the risk of being discovered was now immense. They had planned everything for a swift and clean execution, but somehow, the poison had not worked as expected. Commodus, growing increasingly paranoid and distrustful, began to question everything around him. He felt the first waves of discomfort, but did not yet understand what was happening. However, he was no fool. He quickly realized that something was wrong. The poison, though ineffective in its intended purpose, caused a fatal delay in the conspirators' plans. Instead of a quick death, Commodus suffered for hours as his health slowly deteriorated. Suspicion grew within him, and he immediately began searching for those responsible, questioning everyone in his circle. The air was thick with the possibility of betrayal, and his paranoia intensified. Every gesture from his court, every word spoken by those still loyal to him, seemed suspicious. As Commodus struggled with the effects of the poison, Marcia and Narcissus were racing against time. They knew that if the emperor survived, their own lives would be at stake. The failure of the poison was not just a missed opportunity, it was a warning. If the plan was not completed swiftly, all the conspirators would be exposed and likely executed. Tension mounted as the situation became increasingly desperate. Marcia and Narcissus understood that the only way to ensure Commodus's death now was to take more drastic measures. They were about to cross a point of no return. The empire stood on the brink of a new kind of crisis, and the only apparent solution was the definitive removal of its emperor. After the failed poisoning, Marcia and Narcissus had no choice but to take decisive action. The empire was in chaos, and the only way to restore order was to eliminate Commodus without further delay. They knew they could not risk another failed poisoning attempt. The only alternative was direct assassination, quick and without warning. Narcissus, who had positioned himself as a power broker behind the scenes, knew that the moment to act had arrived. He also understood the immense risk involved. If Commodus survived, all the conspirators would be doomed. There was no room for mistakes. In the days following the failed poisoning, Commodus's trust in those around him eroded even further, making his position more vulnerable. Paranoia consumed him, but at the same time, it made him easier to manipulate for those who had the power to get close to him. The final plan was executed with calculated coldness. While Commodus remained secluded in his residence, recovering from the effects of the poison, he was weak, emotionally drained, and suspicious of everyone. Taking advantage of his vulnerability, Narcissus and Marcia determined that the ideal moment to strike would be during a quiet night when Commodus was relaxed and his circle of trust was at its weakest. Under the cover of night, Narcissus approached the emperor as he rested in his chambers. The curtains were drawn, and the stillness of the residence made the atmosphere tense and heavy. Commodus, no longer expecting another coup attempt, had slipped into a state of indifference toward any potential threats, underestimating the conspirators around him. Narcissus, with a resolute expression, did not hesitate. He used his hands to strangle the emperor, ensuring there was no scream or sign of resistance that could alert the guards or servants. The execution was swift, effective, and silent. In his weakened state, Commodus had no chance to fight back. The last thread of his rule was being severed, and with it, his empire came to an end, without the spectacle or glory he had craved in life. He was silenced in a manner as unceremonious and impersonal as the administration he had led. With his death, Rome experienced a temporary sense of relief. For a moment, peace seemed within reach. However, Commodus's assassination did not bring an immediate solution to the problems he had created. On the contrary, the removal of the emperor left behind an even greater power vacuum, an opportunity for those still entrenched in the political game to seize control. And so, Commodus's story ended abruptly, but the Roman Empire, now leaderless, faced new and even greater challenges. Commodus's death was not merely the end of a decadent reign. It was the spark that ignited a new phase of instability that would shake the foundations of the Roman Empire. The assassination of an emperor always created uncertainty, but Commodus's death carried an even heavier burden. The loss of a leader who, despite his incompetence, had at least maintained a fragile grip on the masses. With Commodus gone, the empire did not find the peace it longed for, but instead plunged into a power struggle, quickly turning into a fierce contest among rival factions eager to dominate Rome. The Praetorian Guard, once fiercely loyal to the emperor, found its authority compromised, now leaderless and directionless. Other generals, provincial governors, and members of the Roman elite saw an opportunity to exploit the collapse for their own gain. The race for power had begun, and the empire, without clear leadership, spiraled into a series of bloody succession battles. The Senate, which had already felt sidelined and devalued during Commodus's reign, now had a chance to reclaim its influence. However, internal divisions ran deep. Some senators, long opposed to Commodus's tyranny, saw his death as an opportunity to restore the republic, while others took a more pragmatic stance, focusing on securing their own political and social survival. However, the failure to establish a strong and legitimate successor, someone with Commodus's authority, led to a series of temporary rulers, none of whom had the power to stabilize the situation. Commodus's death also had a profound impact on the Roman legions. Without a strong and respected emperor to command them, many soldiers felt lost and without purpose. Their loyalty to the emperor dissolved in the face of chaos. Trust in the empire's leadership crumbled, and discipline within the Roman military began to erode. The instability was no longer just a political issue. It had infiltrated the ranks of the army, which had been one of the key pillars holding the empire together. Roman society itself was shaken. During Commodus's rule, social inequalities had already deepened, and now the population, feeling increasingly disconnected from the central government, found itself in a state of turmoil. Food shortages, rampant corruption, and the empire's inability to govern effectively led to protests and uprisings across its territories. Rome, once the most powerful city in the world, now seemed adrift, unable to manage its own internal crises. Commodus's legacy, though quickly erased by the Senate and his successors, was ultimately defined by the chaos he left behind. He was not remembered for grand achievements or wise governance, but for the collapse of the empire he represented. His contemporaries, who saw him as a weak and self-absorbed ruler, were proven right by the consequences of his death. Commodus was not remembered as the great leader he had aspired to be, but as the man who, in trying to forge an image of greatness, ended up destroying the very empire he had sworn to protect. Rome was therefore on the brink of collapse. The empire, fragmented by internal disputes, had lost its central strength. What followed would be an era of turmoil and uprisings, where no leader would have the power to restore Rome's greatness as easily as the death of an emperor. Commodus's legacy was the first of many signs that the Roman Empire was approaching its end, an end that would take centuries to unfold, but was already beginning to take shape in the shadows of what remained of its former glory. Thus, Commodus's reign, marked by decadence and an obsession with his own image, left a legacy of chaos that shook the very foundations of Rome. His death, while marking the fall of an emperor, also signaled the beginning of an era of uncertainty that would pave the way for the fragmentation of the Roman Empire. What do you think about this turbulent period in Roman history? Did Commodus deserve the fate he met, or was his death just another reflection of a decadent era? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this dive into Roman history, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more fascinating stories like this one. See you in the next video. Until then,